Hello class, my name is Owen Bader-Schneider, and today we're going to talk about Romanticism, specifically two of the great poets of that era, Percy Bysshe Shelley and John Keats. Before we get into some of their poetry, let's talk about their backstory. Starting with Percy Bysshe Shelley. He was born into privilege and wealth. His grandfather was a baronet, which means that he stood to inherit a spot in Parliament if he stayed in good standing with his grandfather. He didn't really stay in good standing, and we'll get into that later. He did briefly attend Oxford. He had the money to attend, so that kind of shows part of his wealth and privilege. His grandfather was very rich and did fund part of that Oxford endeavor. However, Shelley was rebellious. He didn't really like some of the views at the time. He ended up publishing a book called The Necessity of Atheism, which promotes atheism, as you might have guessed. And he got kicked out of Oxford for that because the scholars at the time didn't accept that view, so they kicked him out. He did decide to elope with Harriet Westbrook, the daughter of a tavern owner. That was not really liked by his grandfather. He ended up having 2 children with her until he eloped again. He ended up eloping with Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, who later became known as Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein. Mary and Percy did sort of a tour of Western Europe, where they continued to write together. Eventually Harriet, who was looking after Percy's 2 kids, drowned herself, and albeit morbid, this finally allowed Mary and Percy to get married. John Keats was the opposite of Shelley. He lost his mother to tuberculosis. He was very close with his brother, and he did lose his brother George to tuberculosis, which was very sad. Speaking of George and John attended school together. One day, their dad came to visit on a horse because his dad was a stable manager. But on his way home from school, he fell off his horse and his skull fractured, and he died. So Keats is really familiar with death. He understands these themes of death. You can really see that in some of his writing. And all this sorrow kind of pushed him to read. He started to read constantly. You could always see him with a book. Eventually, later in his life, he started to apprentice as a surgeon, but he realized that his passion laid with poetry, and he decided to pursue that as a career. You can really notice that their backstory influences a lot of their writings, and it kind of is what solidifies them as Romanticism poets. Now let's discuss some of their magnum opus, or what I consider to be some of their best works, and we'll do a short reading and analysis of little excerpts. We're going to start with Ozymandias by Percy Bysshe Shelley. This is written in iambic pentameter, and it is talking about a traveler who comes to visit him, and he tells him the story of what he found kind of in Egypt. Ozymandias is the Greek name for Ramses II, the builder pharaoh, if any of you are familiar with him. My name is Ozymandias, king of kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. So Ozymandias is the builder pharaoh, as we just talked about, and he put up a lot of great works in his time, but over time nature, the sand, kind of eroded them away until there was almost nothing, and that's what Shelley's really talking about in this specific excerpt. It goes to his Romanticism because he's talking about nature and kind of it's almost like a religious view of nature, how nature is taking over, and at the end of the day, nature is the only thing left, nature is the only thing standing. Anything we build will have little to no effect on the future. Now let's talk about Ode on a Grecian Urn by Keats. Keats wrote a lot of odes. This is one of them. Specifically in this one, he's marveling at a Grecian urn, and he's talking about how all the characters are frozen in time, and the urn is really the only thing it knows. When old age shall this generation waste, thou shalt remain in midst of other woe than ours, a friend to man, to whom thou say'st, beauty is truth, truth beauty, that is all ye know on earth, and all ye need to know. So specifically in that last 2 lines, it's showing that The urn is really all the urn knows. Everything around it is going to change. Nature is going to change. Nature is all powerful, but this urn is frozen in time. And that's really why this poem is considered part of the Romanticism era. It's not the typical subject you'd see at the time, but it definitely falls within the category. So I hope you class enjoyed those two poems, or excerpts of the poems, and that is my presentation on Shelley and Keats.